The sight of the stranger once more revived memories of Nettleton, and North Dormer shrank to its real size. As she looked up and down it, from Lawyer Royall's faded red house at one end to the white church at the other, she pitilessly took its measure. There it lay, a weather-beaten, sunburnt village of the hills, abandoned of men, left apart by railway, trolley, telegraph, and all the forces that link life to life in modern communities. It had no shops, no theaters, no lectures, no business block. Only a church that was opened every other Sunday if the state of the roads permitted, and a library for which no new books had been bought for 20 years, and where the old ones mouldered undisturbed on the damp shelves. Yet Charity Royall had always been told that she ought to consider it a privilege that her lot had been cast in North Dormer. She knew that, compared to the place she had come from, North Dormer represented all the blessings of the most refined civilization. Everyone in the village had told her so ever since she had been brought there as a child. Even old Miss Hatchard had said to her, on a terrible occasion in her life, "My child, you must never cease to remember that it was Mr. Royall who brought you down from the mountain." She had been brought down from the mountain, from the scarred cliff that lifted its sullen wall above the lesser slopes of Eagle Range, making a perpetual background of gloom to the lonely valley. The mountain was a good 15 miles away, but it rose so abruptly from the lower hills that it seemed almost to cast its shadow over North Dormer. And it was like a great magnet drawing the clouds and scattering them in storm across the valley. If ever, in the purest summer sky, there trailed a thread of vapor over North Dormer, it drifted to the mountain as a ship drifts to a whirlpool, and was caught among the rocks, torn up and multiplied, to sweep back over the village in rain and darkness. Charity was not very clear about the mountain, but she knew it was a bad place and a shame to have come from, and that whatever befell her in North Dormer, she ought, as Miss Hatchard had once reminded her, to remember that she had been brought down from there and hold her tongue and be thankful. She looked up at the mountain, thinking of these things, and tried, as usual, to be thankful. But the sight of the young man turning in at Miss Hatchard's gate had brought back the vision of the glittering streets of Nettleton, and she felt ashamed of her old sun hat and sick of North Dormer and jealously aware of Annabel Balch of Springfield opening her blue eyes somewhere far off on glories greater than the glories of Nettleton. "How I hate everything," she said again. Halfway down the street she stopped at a weak-hinged gate. Passing through it, she walked down a brick path to a queer little brick temple with white wooden columns, supporting a pediment on which was inscribed in tarnished gold letters, "The Honorius Hatchard Memorial Library, 1832. Honorius Hatchard had been old Miss Hatchard's great-uncle, though she would undoubtedly have reversed the phrase and put forward as her only claim to distinction the fact that she was his great-niece. For Honorius Hatchard, in the early years of the 18th century, had enjoyed a modest celebrity. As the marble tablet in the interior of the library informed its infrequent visitors, he had possessed marked literary gifts, written a series of papers called The Recluse of Eagle Range, enjoyed the acquaintance of Washington Irving and Fitzgreen Halleck, and had been cut off in his flower by a fever contracted in Italy. Such had been the sole link between North Dormer and literature, a link piously commemorated by the erection of the monument where Charity Royall, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, sat at her desk under a freckled steel engraving of the deceased author, and wondered if he felt any deader in his grave than she did in his library. Entering her prison house with a listless step, she took off her hat, hung it on a plaster bust of Minerva, opened the shutters, leaned out to see if there were any eggs in the swallow's nest above one of the windows, and finally, seating herself behind the desk, drew out a roll of cotton lace and a steel crochet hook. She was not an expert workwoman, and it had taken her many weeks to make the half-yard of narrow lace which she kept wound about the buckram back of a disintegrated copy of The Lamplighter. But there was no other way of getting any lace to trim her summer blouse, and since Allie Hawes, the poorest girl in the village, had shown herself in church with enviable transparencies about the shoulders, Charity's hook had traveled faster. She unrolled the lace, dug the hook into a loop, and bent to the task with furrowed brows. Suddenly the door opened, and before she had raised her eyes, she knew that the young man she had seen going in at the Hatchard gate had entered the library. Without taking any notice of her, he began to move slowly about the long vault-like room, his hands behind his back, his short-sighted eyes peering up and down the rows of dusty bindings. At length he reached the desk and stood before her. "Have you a card catalogue?" he asked in a pleasing, abrupt voice, and the oddness of the question caused her to drop her work. "A what?" "Why, you know—" He broke off, and she became conscious that he was looking at her for the first time, having apparently, on his entrance, included her in his general short-sighted survey as part of the furniture of the library. The fact that, in discovering her, he lost the thread of his remark did not escape her attention, and she looked down and smiled. He smiled also. "No, I don't suppose you do know," he corrected himself. "In fact, it would be almost a pity." She thought she detected a slight condescension in his tone and asked sharply, "Why?" "Because it's so much pleasanter in a small library like this to poke about by oneself with the help of the librarian." He added the last phrase so respectfully that she was mollified, and rejoined with a sigh, "I'm afraid I can't help you much." "Why?" he questioned in his turn, and she replied that there weren't many books anyhow, and that she'd hardly read any of them. "The worms are getting at them," she added gloomily. "Are they? Well, that's a pity, for I see there are some good ones." He seemed to have lost interest in their conversation, and he strolled away again, apparently forgetting her. His indifference nettled her, and she picked up her work, resolved not to offer him the least assistance. Apparently he did not need it, for he spent a long time with his back to her, lifting down, one after another, the tall, cobwebby volumes from a distant shelf. "Oh, I say," he exclaimed, and looking up, she saw that he had drawn out his handkerchief and was carefully wiping the edges of the book in his hand. The action struck her as an unwarranted criticism on her care of the books, and she said irritably, "It's not my fault if they're dirty." He turned around and looked at her with reviving interest. "Ah, then you're not the librarian." "Of course I am, but I can't dust all these books. Besides, nobody ever looks at them now Miss Hatchett's too lame to come round." "No, I suppose not." He laid down the book he had been wiping and stood considering her in silence. She wondered if Miss Hatchett had sent him around to pry into the way the library was looked after, and suspicion increased her resentment. "I saw you going into her house just now, didn't I?" she asked, with the New England avoidance of the proper name. She was determined to find out why he was poking among her books. "Miss Hatchett's house? Yes, she's my cousin, and I'm staying there," the young man answered, adding, as if to disarm a visible distrust, "My name is Harney, Lucius Harney. She may have spoken of me." "No, she hasn't," said Charity, wishing she could have said, "Yes, she has." "Oh, well," said Miss Hatchett's cousin with a laugh. And after another pause, during which it occurred to Charity that her answer had not been encouraging, he remarked, "You don't seem strong on architecture." Her bewilderment was complete. The more she wished to appear to understand him, the more unintelligible his remarks became. He reminded her of the gentleman who had explained the pictures at Nettleton, and the weight of her ignorance settled down on her again like a pall. "I mean, I can't see that you have any books on the old houses about here. I suppose, for that matter, this part of the country hasn't been much explored. They all go on doing Plymouth and Salem. So stupid. My cousin's house, now, is remarkable. This place must have had a past, must have been more of a place once." He stopped short, with the blush of a shy man who overhears himself and fears he has been voluble. "I'm an architect, you see, and I'm hunting up old houses in these parts." She stared. "Old houses? Everything's old in North Dormer, isn't it?" "The folks are, anyhow." He laughed and wandered away again. "Haven't you any kind of history of the place? I think there was one written about 1840, a book or a pamphlet about its first settlement," he presently said from the farther end of the room. She pressed her crochet hook against her lip and pondered. There was such a work, she knew. North Dormer and the Early Townships of Eagle County. She had a special grudge against it because it was a limp weekly book that was always either falling off the shelf or slipping back and disappearing if one squeezed it in between sustaining volumes. She remembered